Good evening. Welcome to Brainstorms. So thank you for being here. Thank you for braving the threatening weather. So it's a big night. It's our 18th Brainstorm, at the last one of the second season. And we added it up. We've hit a total of about 6,000 audience members in the 2 years. So thank you so much for that. Yeah. And we have a lot of people to thank. I mean, thank you. I know that from talking to y'all that so many of you are here because a friend told you about it. And so that's always the nicest favor you can do for us is just spread the word, as if Facebook isn't good enough. But thank you for that. So because it's the last one of the season, I want to say some special thank yous. So first of all, we have volunteers from St. Edward's and from UT, our undergraduates, the neuroscience majors, and they run around, so thank you to them. They're there, thank you. I want to thank Elena Silva. So she's the one who runs around and organizes all this and has to deal with all the headaches. So thank you, Elena, for another. The most important thank you is we want to thank Alondra Garcia. So Alondra's a UT undergraduate. She's graduating in, 2 weeks? She's been with us for 2 years? 10 years? It's hard to think of Alondra as an undergraduate because she's worked in the neuroscience office and she's been so indispensable that she just seems like, one of the staff and one of the family, but she's leaving us because she accomplished her mission. So we want to especially say thank you for all the time. So for how many of you is this the first Brainstorms? So great, well, great, welcome. How many of you heard about it from a friend? Facebook or social media? There you go, okay, about usual. So thanks for being here. Hopefully we'll impress you so much you'll come back. So because there's always so many new people here, let me just give the quick spiel about what we're up to. So this is sponsored by the Department of Neuroscience at UT, and it's just our goal to interact with non-scientists about what we're up to. And it's just our philosophy that a world-class neuroscience department, one of its jobs should be to reach out to people and tell you about what we're doing, listen to what you care about. And I can tell you that we learn as much from you as you do from us. So we want to make sure that the conversation continues after tonight. So what that means is that we're going to have we'll have a lengthy question and answer period tonight. If you don't get your question answered, or if you think of one on the drive home, or after you watch the Astros win later tonight, email me. There's cards in the back, or it's easy. It's just mock@utexas.edu. I measure our success of each one of these by how many emails I get for questions, and so you can make it a successful night. Don't be shy, okay? So thank you for that, and just remember that we put conversation in the title for a reason. That's what we want to be doing. So to sort of hit cleanup then tonight for the last one of the season, we have Dr. Nace Golding here. Nace is a member of the Department of Neuroscience and the Center for Learning and Memory. Nace is really, every PhD is the expert of something, but Nace is the authority in the whole world on the auditory system, and in particular on sound localization. He is the person, and we're really proud to have him. The other thing that I wanted to say about Nace is he's actually the author. I don't know if you remember this. He's the author of the name Brainstorms. So if this neuroscience thing doesn't work out for him, I guess you have a future in marketing or something. Anyway, so we owe Nace we were brainstorming, and Nace came up with, let's call it UT Brainstorm. So there you go. So thanks for being here. Just the format, Nace is going to tell us what he tells us. Then we're going to have a couple of other UT professors come up as panelists, and we'll answer as many questions as we can until it's time to leave. You can see the microphones. We've passed out some cards, or maybe you grabbed one on the way in. We'll pick up cards if you've written down a question, and we'll go back and forth between card questions and microphone questions until we're done, okay? So thank you for being here, and thank you, Nace, and have fun on the last one of the season. So.
Thank you. All right, let's do a little microphone check. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, sound is good. So thank you for braving the possible bad weather to be here. I appreciate it. And let me just start out by saying there's probably nothing more terrifying and exciting at the same time than giving a general public lecture on my work, not being able to fall back on all the comfortable jargon that we use in our field, but to really try to communicate it, at a very general level with everyday people. So instead of our specialty scientists, we are not regular people. Let's just get that out of the way. So a little bit of a admission. So I have to admit I bit off more than I could chew with the topic. So it will be about the auditory system, our sonic world, hearing impairments, but maybe a little bit less about music today because unless you want to stay for another hour, but I think probably not. So let's just start at the beginning, which is, well, maybe a little more personal introduction. Why am I interested in the auditory system, and what gets me excited about studying it? Like a lot of people who study the auditory system, I've always had a long-standing interest in music. Personally, my childhood kiddie album was Rubber Soul by the Beatles, and I'm the child of two musicians. Both my parents play piano. One's a physicist, the other's a music teacher. So music's really been part of my life all the way from the beginning of it. But of course, I think what also interests me about the auditory system is that, of course, it's required, intimately involved in the way that we communicate with each other. And communication and auditory communication is really a lot of what makes us who we are and gives us our individual personalities. And so it makes it also that much more devastating when we start to lose hearing and our ability to communicate is degraded. So it's not only a really interesting problem in the abstract, but also a really important problem sort of for our health. So without further ado, so our topics for today are going to revolve around, first of all, I am a professor, I can't help myself, so I'm going to have to try to show you what's really cool about the auditory system. And so we're going to go back. There we go. Got to use the right buttons. So go over what is sound? How do we detect it? How do we encode it in our brains? Then we're going to talk about hearing loss, tinnitus, the ringing in the ears, and restoring hearing using auditory prosthetics. There we go. So let's start off with a little tour of the auditory system. My favorite slide, which I always like to sneak in as much as I can. So what is sound? Sounds, of course, are vibrations in the air. If you have a tuning fork and waggles, you have compressions and rarefactions, expansions of air molecules that have a certain time signature. They vary in time and over distance. And, of course, that's a very different modality than the way that we communicate in our brains. But there are, of course, many other features of sounds. Their physical attributes of sound include the spectral content, the frequency composition of it, the loudness, and, of course, the aforementioned timing features. Of course, when we process that information in the brain, we need to extract other pieces of information from those sounds, including the what and the where, the location of the sound, where is it coming from, the significance of the sound, whether it's communication, warning of a predator, we use it to find food or a potential mate, etc. So how does sound get into our brains? So let's start with the ears themselves. Right, sound goes into the canal, vibrates the tympanic membrane, our eardrums. It pushes some tiny middle ear bones that then create vibrations in a little fluid-filled chamber, a little coiled chamber called the cochlea. And inside this cochlea is a really delicate, thin piece of membrane And that membrane has very special qualities. It vibrates, it has a tendency to vibrate differently on different ends of it. So one end only vibrates when there are high frequency sounds, and the other end only vibrates when there are low frequency sounds. So what that does, it enables this membrane actually to take sounds of different frequencies and splay them out over space. And there's a nice little video of how this happens, a little tour of this process. So we fly through the middle, through the ear canal and past the eardrum, and we're going to uncoil the cochlea, and we're going to get a little view of this uncoiled piece of membrane called the basilar membrane. And then we're going to give it a little stimulus, a little musical stimulus. So it vibrates at low frequencies here, middle frequencies higher, and then high frequencies at the other end. And you can see when there's multiple sounds, they can vibrate at the same time. So the important thing I want you to point out, I think I have to wait till this is over, no? So with this little trick, we've now separated frequencies into different spatial locations. So the job of the nervous system now is just to wire to these different locations in order to actually convey the different frequencies to the brain. Kind of a neat trick. But we still have to transduce those vibrations into something the brain understands, which is electrical activity. And the character that does this is one of the most specialized cells in the brain called the hair cell. You can see them, oops, still haven't got used to the buttons yet. There we go. So here are these cells down here, and on the tops of these cells are these little rows of what they call stereocilia, the hairs of the hair cell. You can see them really close up here. They are tiny. They're just fractions of a micron in length. And they move just on a scale of nanometers. And when these stereocilia move, when they encounter the vibrations that are being given to them on the basilar membrane, they causes an electrical event to occur in these stereocilia when they're bent. And without getting into the details, they then trigger neurotransmitter release that neurotransmitter onto the neural elements that are actually attached to them. And that electrical activity then gets conveyed to the brain. So now we've succeeded in taking physical vibrations in the air, converted into the water, into a fluid, and then it gets transduced into electrical activity. Okay, so moving right along, I'm not going to get into the details of all the different auditory areas in the brain. I'm going to treat it as a black box. This black box, also my way of sneaking in a science fiction reference into my talk. So instead of going into the really specifics of the auditory circuitry, I want to really, to really cut to the chase, tell you about what's really unique and special about the auditory system and the way it encodes sound information. And one of the differences, between the auditory system and other systems in the brain has to do with the speed at which it has to operate. Sounds are fast. Our hearing range spans from a few hundred hertz all the way up to, if you're hearing well, up to about 20 kilohertz. That means that the nervous system has to respond thousands of times per second. Most neural circuits in the brain don't operate that fast. So the auditory system has had to develop specializations to be faster than the normal brain circuit. So what I've shown here is a little electrical response from a typical neuron in the brain. Specifically, this actually comes from the hippocampus, an area that's involved in learning and memory, but that's really not important for this demonstration. And it's an electrical response that's triggered by neurotransmitter release. And it's pretty typical in that it takes about 10 milliseconds to rise and a few hundred more milliseconds to fall back down to baseline. So that's sort of the time course over which this neuron operates. Well, so in specific circuits in the brain that are concerned with timing in the auditory system, here is the comparable response. That's the whole thing. If we zoom in on it a little bit, you can see just how fast this response is. It takes about 100 or 200 microseconds to reach its peak, and it lasts no more than a millisecond, 1,000th of a second. So if only there was an analogy that could actually relate the auditory system to other neurons in the nervous system. Oh, there we go. So you can think of the auditory system essentially as souped-up brain circuitry that really has to operate on about 1,000 times more precisely and 1,000 times faster than most circuits in the brain. So, of course, we like pickup trucks in Texas. They're utilitarian. They get us from A to B. I'm sure many people would like to study the nervous system equivalent of the pickup truck. Not everybody really wants the pulse-raising thrill ride that is the auditory system, so there's something for everybody. Okay, but on a more serious note, so what is this timing actually used for? There are many circuits in the auditory brain that are actually used for both encoding the frequency content of sounds as well as their location. And without getting into the details of it, I want to actually show you a simple demonstration of one neuron in one specific brain area that actually extracts both type of information from about both of those modalities at the same time. So what I'm showing you here, let's first, is a neural response to a sound stimulus. And so this comes from a rodent, since most people object to having electrodes placed into their heads. This is a rodent, and the sound stimulus is one that mimics a sound basically horizontally spinning around the head. And it goes around the head like a deer fly around you when you're hiking in the woods, with a periodicity of about 1 second per rotation. And so what you're going to see now in the neural response is this waxing and waning of the neural activity with every rotation of the sound through the head. So this neuron is responding maximally where the activity is highest to one spot in its horizontal location. So in neuroscience, we refer to that as it's tuned to a specific location in space. I also want to point out how fast the individual events are. My scale bars dropped off this, but each of these events at the peak of these responses, where the inputs are actually most aligned in time, are only about a millisecond long. So they're really fast, and they're going at a very high rate. Stimulus is about 400 hertz. This response is going 1 for 1 at 400 hertz. That's one response for every 2.5 milliseconds. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is simply play this response to you. So you can hear some crackling sounds. That crackling is actually the neural activity at the very peak of the response. That's good enough. All right, so you heard a tone actually corresponds to the 400 hertz stimulus, and you heard the crackling, waxing, and waning. That crackling refers to the response to the neuron to that specific location in space. But what you might have assumed, or maybe you didn't think about it at all, is that I had played the stimulus and superimposed it. But I actually didn't. All I did was take this raw response and just play it out my speakers of the computer. So what actually happened is I took the neural code from a single neuron in the auditory brain, played it, transduced it into sound through the auditory speakers. You retransduced it with your auditory systems into neural activity, sent it to your brain, and you got the right perception of the sound, this 400 hertz sound, from the activity of a single neuron. You are essentially hearing through a single neuron in a rodent's brain, which is pretty remarkable if you think about it. So what that speaks to is the power of the computation that these neurons are doing. Such a rich amount of information being conveyed. You don't need hundreds of thousands of neurons conveying this information. You need a much smaller population of neurons to be able to effectively convey both the frequency and the place of the sound stimulus with a high degree of efficacy. Okay, so we need good timing then for spatial perception. We need it to, of course, detect and avoid natural predators, or at least around campus. I think our most dangerous situation are these motorized scooters that are going around. So this could be adaptive. We, of course, need it for speech comprehension. So in addition to not getting hit by buses, what's really not recognized is how much we use spatial information to help us understand speech. And this room is actually a good example of that situation where somebody might be whispering behind you. There's probably an air conditioning system that has a low hum. But because you know where I am, you can actually focus your brain just on the sounds that are coming from me or wherever that speaker is that's actually projecting my voice, and tune out all the other extraneous information that is coming from other sources. And if you've ever talked to anyone who's ever had a hearing aid, you know their single biggest complaint is that the hearing aid amplifies all the extraneous information. So what that reflects is our brains are actually doing some pretty complicated and pretty remarkable computations to allow us to basically filter out what we don't want and to focus on what we do want. And this temporal information, time information, is also really important in addition for speech, but also perception of music. So I have one more demonstration of that. So pitch perception, which of course we need for music performance and also speech comprehension, is an important activity. What I have here is a demonstration of, I guess I need to use my computer for this. Here's a pure tone to play a little musical melody. A little ditty, and you can see that here's the spectral compound, a spectrogram here that shows that most of the frequencies are in a few hundred hertz of this pure tone sequence, and here's actually the first note in a much compressed time frame, showing that it's this pure tone sinusoidal modulating stimulus. Now, what the next sequence is I'm going to play not only this pure tone, but a bunch of higher harmonics, sort of multiples of the frequency of the tone. Here it is. Sounds different. It's clearly more complicated, it sounds more complex, but the pitch sequence that you heard is the same as the pure tone, even though spectrally you can see it's much more complex. It has lots of different frequency content. So it demonstrates that pitch is not the same thing as frequency. It's the perception of a dominant frequency. And finally, I'm going to play a sequence where the first few harmonics, including the main pure tone frequency, is actually left out. So it sounds tinnier. It sounds a little bit different, but the melody is the same. You still got all of the pitch, you've got the same pitch percept as the other two sequences. And what I want to point out is that all the primary frequencies, what we call the fundamental frequencies, are actually completely missing from this stimulus. So the frequencies the pitches that you're hearing don't have those frequencies in them. So what you are constructing, you're using the timing information that is present in these stimuli. So with these higher harmonics, these are the amplitudes of the events, and you can see there's a periodicity to the way that these harmonic complexes sum in time. And that periodicity actually happens every 3 milliseconds, which corresponds to about the 300 hertz fundamental frequency of the original pure tones sequence. So you're extracting the pitch from the timing information and not the specific frequency information that is being carried in your neural pathways. So again, it shows the power of timing and also reinforces the need to convey timing with high degree of precision and accuracy. And particularly if you're musicians, you can get really good at pitch perception. So That's our sort of quick tour of the auditory system. I'm going to now talk a little bit about what happens when the auditory system starts to not function optimally, and specifically about hearing loss. How many of you in this room actually have some hearing loss? Okay, I would say that looks like about 50% of the audience. Well, the news is actually not great for the rest of you. So age is the strongest predictor of hearing loss among adults from the ages of 20 to 69, and with the greatest amount of hearing loss in the 60 to 69 group, maybe not surprisingly. Men are actually almost twice as likely as women to have hearing loss among those ages 20 to 69. I'm sorry, guys, maybe I should have said that a little bit more loudly. Okay, and really the most disturbing statistic is that 75% of us, once we get over 70 years old, are going to have significant hearing loss. So nobody ever died of hearing loss, but of course, it's a devastating condition, and it's going to hit a huge percentage of the population. When it's really severe, it can lead to social isolation, depression, even early onset dementia. So it's really kind of contributes to a domino effect for other, I think, neurological illnesses. So what happens when we are overexposed to loud noise? This is part of our modern life, particularly around central Austin. There's particularly this campus. There's always construction going on. We're just inundated, bombarded by loud sounds. If you watch the average adult that's under 30 years of age, they've got earbuds in their ears and they're blasting sound directly into their eardrums. We're always being exposed and overexposed to loud sounds. So what happens when that happens? So here's a demonstration of a loud noise, 100 decibels for 2 hours. Translated to Austin terms, that's going to ACL, Austin city limits for a concert. And immediately afterwards, you might have the following symptoms. You might have some ringing in your ears, feeling of fullness in your head. Your speech can sound muffled and hard to understand. In other words, you have an elevated threshold for hearing. The next day, though, you wake up and you feel fine. You seem to be hearing just fine. There's all these symptoms have disappeared. It's all good, right? Well, not quite. So one of the concepts that has emerged from research especially in recent years, is the concept of hidden hearing loss. So even though your audiograms, your detection of sounds appears perfectly normal, there are problems. And that problem has to do with the loss of the neural elements that are actually carrying information to the brain, and even the neural elements in the brain itself. So here's a little an example here. What we're looking at here is a little side view of the cochlea. And this little outline here is the body of one of these hair cells. They're sort of gourd-shaped cells in the cochlea. And what these little black-red speckles around here are just labeled synapses. These are the synaptic connections that are ultimately going to trigger neurotransmitter release and drive electrical activity, which is then conveyed to the brain. And that is conveyed over these neurons that actually carry this information. All the auditory information that these hair cells transduce are carried through neurons that form one nerve, the auditory nerve. Everything that we hear goes through this nerve. There are no ways to bypass it. It's all we've got. And so after this hearing loss, we can see a couple different things. One is these hair cells get a little smaller, a little shorter, and even though it might be a little hard to see in this room, you can see there are fewer speckles, fewer synapses. So you've got some synaptic loss, and more specifically, you've also lost a fraction of the population of neurons that are carrying this information to the brain. But there are still some neurons, and so I would like to make a visual analogy to what would happen if you were to lose a fraction of your population carrying auditory information to the brain. So here's a visual scene. This is the Sydney Opera House, courtesy of a colleague in my laboratory, Catherine Connolly, who also supplied a number of other slides in this presentation, so I should gratefully acknowledge that. And we can see this with high resolution. We can see the very sharp edges of the roof line, the texture of the roof, the colors. It's if our vision is good. It's, of course, high resolution, but if we start to lose the neural elements, we have a less density in our retinas, or perhaps the neurons in our brain carrying this information, it's going to start to look like this, right? We can sort of still see the same image, but it's pixelated. There just aren't enough neural elements that are actually carrying information, so we start to lose the details. We can still detect the images there, right? But we lose the richness of the information contained. And if it goes, we get more and more loss, this image gets blurrier and blurrier. Even though we can still detect there's something there, we can barely make out what that image is by the end of it. So this is what's going on with hidden hearing loss. When you go in for a hearing test, it comes out perfectly normal, but where it really becomes challenging, and many elderly people complain about this, when you come into a very challenging listening environment, like a crowded cafeteria, and you're trying to follow one conversation in a very challenging, rich, noisy environment, that's when losing the number of auditory elements carrying information into your brains is really going to harm your ability to actually perceive what that person is saying. Okay, so I want to now turn to another topic that I think probably impinges on many of us, which is tinnitus, or I've also heard it pronounced tinnitus, tomato. Even the experts don't seem to agree on how to pronounce it. I've heard it both ways. Let me ask you, how many of you actually have had now or at some point in your lives ringing in the ears, or tinnitus? Oh my God, that was a lot more than I expected. That looked like 1/3 to half of you. So that's shocking. So for the rest of you that don't have tinnitus, tinnitus is a phantom perception of sound, or ringing of the ears. It can be tonal in quality. It varies. It can be very much more complex. It can be sort of noise-like in its quality. And it can have really pretty diverse origins and mechanisms. Some forms of tinnitus can be peripheral in origin. In other words, it starts in the cochlea, in the inner ear, and it's thought to be an overexcitable cochlea, that it's signaling too much, too richly. Other forms of tinnitus can be central, meaning that it originates in the brain. So, for example, if you have damage to the cochlea, or in some kind of surgeries, unfortunately, the cochlea is actually completely removed from the brain, people actually have phantom perception of sound, even though there's no information actually being conveyed to the brain by the cochlea. So it's quite analogous to a phantom limb. There's perception of sound that clearly is not there. So tinnitus in the brain, the idea is that the neural signatures of tinnitus mimic the brain's response to acoustic stimulation. So the brain is always active. There's spontaneous activity all the time, not just in the auditory system, but in just about every brain area. And it rattles along at a low rate. And then when we have some kind of sound, like as you're encountering right now, we have an increase in the firing rate. So this would be sort of a representation of the neural activity of a group of cells in the brain, and that signaling becomes faster and more robust in response to the sound. And the idea with tinnitus is that you now have hyperactivity, that too much firing at a very high rate, and rates that actually mimic the rate of the response to the sound activity. So it's as if you're hearing a sound all the time, even whether or not there's actually a sound present or not. So here's the problem. Tinnitus has been extraordinarily difficult to pinpoint because we don't have to pay too much attention to all these different brain areas, but here's just representations of different stages of auditory processing, from low levels in the brain all the way up to the cerebral cortex. And here's lots of different complicated pathways, and the problem is that this hyperactivity that emerges in the brain can happen in a lot of these different locations, from way low down to the first stages of processing all the way up to higher centers. And so particularly the higher you go in the brain, it's hard to know whether the hyperactivity that you record in the brain is actually originating in that location, or it's simply being driven by hyperactivity in lower pathways. So it's been a little bit of a whack-a-mole kind of situation where it's been hard to know where the hyperactivity actually emerges and what's the generator of the tinnitus. And causes of tinnitus probably could include diverse mechanisms, like an increase in the excitatory pathways. Excitatory connections are hyperactive, an increase in sort of the individual sensitivity of the individual neurons in these pathways. Or on the converse side, a loss of inhibition. So the brain has both excitatory neurons and inhibitory neurons. The inhibitory neurons are really important for preventing this kind of overexcitability. And so if you start to lose inhibitory neurons, now that you essentially release the brakes on electrical signaling in the brain. And that can also involve loss of connections and even loss of excitatory drive onto those inhibitory neurons. So this should sound a little bit familiar, at least it does to me, and I would like to make the analogy to another disease of overexcitability, which is epilepsy. So similar to tinnitus, it's overexcitability. It can have a lot of different mechanistic causes. There isn't one type of epilepsy. It can start in, although there are often very common areas where there are epileptic foci, depending on which type you have, it could be have lots of different mechanisms and places of origin in the brain. So, like epilepsy, tinnitus has been hard to track down experimentally. It's also very hard to study in animal models because you can't ask a mouse whether it has ringing in the ears. There are the kind of indirect ways one can get at this, but it's proven to be tricky. Okay, so we're going right on time. So I want to end, so this is kind of all a downer, right? Nervous systems, we're all heading toward deafness in one way or another. So, but all is not gloomy. Right? So I want to end with some of the success stories of auditory research, which is the cochlear implant. So for deaf individuals or individuals who've had damage, particularly early on in their lives as children, is now actually it has been possible since the 1970s to actually reintroduce activity in the auditory system in a way that actually can at least roughly approximates the sound stimuli that we normally receive when our ears are intact. So the cochlear implant is one that it's really quite amazing that this works. You have a transmitter and a little speech processor and microphone that sort of sits behind your ear. This is probably an old slide. Probably modern systems are much smaller and much more efficient than the older models. And they literally implant this right into the bone on the side of your head. And then attach an electrode, a little wire that essentially threads it through your cochlea, that fluid-filled duct that transduces the sound vibrations into electrical activity. Okay, so here's a little demonstration of how this actually happens. This is from Australian source, so whether this represents normal auditory activity, given the Australian accent, is kind of up for debate. Sorry, Australians.
Head, hood, hod.
So you can sort of see the frequency content of this speech sounds at the bottom here. And that's going to be received by the receiver, transmitted to the electrodes that are now being fed into the cochlea. So now we can see this electrode array. All these little squares here are different electrodes. Here's the low frequencies. Here are the higher frequencies. And now we're going to see how it stimulates the nervous system. Here are the auditory nerve fibers that are being activated and stimulated spatially by these different patterns of little shocks that these electrodes are applying to the nervous system that essentially jump-starts the electrical activity and sends it to the brain. Now, the problem is, of course, these electrodes are kind of spaced far apart. It doesn't have the resolution, right? We talked earlier about having lots of neural elements conveying information. Well, these electrodes are pretty gross. They stimulate wide areas, stimulate a whole bunch of neurons at the same time, so it's quite a bit more crude than what would happen in a normal situation, but it's better than nothing. So what does a cochlear implant actually sound like? So I've got a little demonstration here.
The BBC would like to announce that the next scene is not considered suitable for family viewing. It contains scenes of violence involving people's heads and arms
Okay, that really is not suitable for public viewing. So we'll just cut that off right there. So here's the same speech pattern that's now sort of simulated through the best possible simulation of what it might sound like to a cochlear implant recipient. So of course that sounded awful. But you actually, if you listened pretty hard, you could sort of you could actually make out some of the words, and you can imagine if you're living with this all your life, you could actually get quite good at coming out with understanding speech patterns. And many people with cochlear implants also are expert lip readers. And so between reading somebody's lips and getting this, albeit crude, approximation of auditory input, they can actually do pretty well understanding language. So this technology, the cochlear implant, has been around since the 1970s. It's actually the first or neural machine interface that was actually invented. And as computer technology and processors get better and better, so do the cochlear implants. And for those individuals that have problems in their cochlea, there are even now implants that can directly stimulate the brain, either in the brainstem or even in the midbrain, and actually essentially bypass all of the auditory nerve and the cochlea in the periphery. Okay, so the last little bit is I told you earlier that part of what happens with hearing damage is that we lose synapses. We lose some of the neural elements. And one of the interesting findings of cochlear implant research, since researchers can actually implant deaf animals with smaller cochlear implants, cats, and perhaps guinea pigs, we can actually study what happens in the brain when we start to stimulate a brain that really has not had a normal pattern of activity. And the encouraging news is that it has been possible, at least in some brain areas, to show that there's at least partial restoration of the number of synapses, either inhibitory or excitatory synapses that are in these brain areas, giving us some hope that there's, by actually mimicking, even crudely, the stimulation patterns of hearing, that we can actually have the nervous system respond and actually start potentially form the right connections and improve the ability of individuals to actually encode auditory information. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up and give you the take-home messages. So I told you earlier that your auditory system contains what I will call souped-up neurons, neurons that respond up to 1,000 times faster and more precisely than other neurons in the brain. They encode timing with microsecond precision. And I showed you why that's useful, right? We need this microsecond precision to know where sounds are located, and also the frequency content and even the pitch content of sounds. You need to protect your ears from loud noises. I was pretty cavalier about this when I was younger, but now when I mow my lawn, I put on these big, large noise-canceling headphones to try to reduce how much damage I'm doing to my ears as I'm mowing for long periods of time, or any kind of machinery. Hair cells don't regenerate. You have everything that you're going to have for your life. You lose them, they're gone forever. Researchers are trying to figure out how to regenerate them, but it's not there yet. So hearing loss leads to social isolation, depression, early onset dementia. Tinnitus is the phantom perception of sound, and it has diverse places of origin and mechanisms, much like epilepsy, and we don't yet have effective treatments. Studies are ongoing, and there are ways that we can lessen the effects of tinnitus, but some of it's a little bit, whether or not that applies to an individual, it's a little bit of a hit and miss kind of game. Cochlear implants are really marvelous digital devices that bypass non-functioning hair cell receptors to provide sound to the brain when our normal transduction apparatus is compromised. And implants are more effective if the subject is still young or that the patient has experienced sound prior to deafness. A little experience is actually helpful to actually form the correct synapses form the correct wiring in our nervous systems. So that's the content of what I'm going to be talking about today. I think at this point I will turn it back over to Mike. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, so if we do questions a couple of different ways. So we have our volunteers with 3x5 cards. If you want to write down a question, we'll pick it up and our panelists will have it. We have microphones if you want to get up and ask a question. I'm going to let Nace introduce his panelists and get things started. So if you have a card, you've written down a question, or you want a card, raise your hand. We'll get your question and pick it up, and we'll get started with the questions as quickly as we can, okay? So.
All right, yeah, I'd like to introduce both Doctors Alex Huth and Liberty Hamilton. You're both young, rising stars in our campus faculty. They both work on the auditory system. I think collectively we'll love to take your questions.
Hi, I have a question on the mic, if I should just get started. So my whole life have struggled to sing in a way that is not punishing to others. Like I struggle to stay, in the right key, on pitch, not get pitchy. And I recently discovered, hey, if I plug one of my ears, it really does help. Like I can hear myself, like I'm actually singing a little better. What's up with that? What is that about? And I've also experimented. I'm like, hey, does it make a difference if I'm plugging this ear or that ear? So when I see your presentation and you're talking about, the loss, I'm thinking like, I know that there's a thing, like you have more hearing loss in one ear than the other. So is that related to pitch perception in that way? Is that why when I plug one ear, I can sing a little bit better?
So I'll try and take part of that. I'm not sure that I would say it's necessarily related to pitch perception, and it sounds like, from how you describe it, you're not amusic. So there are people who actually are completely unable to recognize melodies, and you could play them a series of notes.
That's not me.
Okay, so you don't
like
have
I'm a
that.
DJ,
okay.
And I'm like a record collector, and I'm very attuned to like what's good.
It's probably more about just being able to attune to your own voice, and so a lot of singers actually do use auditory feedback in order to increase the level of their own voice while they're singing and sort of get rid of external sounds, and that does seem to help people. As for why one ear versus the other, I don't know. It seems like it's probably.
Is it a thing like going into mono as opposed to stereo? In terms of like hearing your voice better, is it like you're blocking other external noises, and that's why you hear yourself better?
It could be that. There's also, you can hear through what's called bone conduction hearing, which is your bones actually vibrating. And then you can also hear through air going through your ear canal. So perhaps it's changing the ratio of those two types of hearing. But
one relevant question might be whether you've had a hearing test.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you for the talk. So I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm a computer scientist. So it sounds a lot like what the cochlear implants do is a Fourier transform of the incoming sound wave to separate out the frequency components and essentially have that quote unquote decoded by the neurons. Assuming that my line of thinking is correct, a couple of questions. One is the fact that it sounded really noisy in that artificial. Is it just because the device is not really separating out the frequency components with the same level of accuracy as the biological counterpart with the vibration of the basilar membrane? And the second question is, do you really have to have the cochlear implant implanted in the cochlea? Could you just have a device, does the Fourier transform really well, and sort of does something like a sensory substitution to basically send the correct temporal frequency code to the synapses or deeper in the brain where the synaptic pathways still exist and get potentially perfect hearing.
Sure. So yeah, it is just doing a Fourier transform. I mean, that is actually what the ear is doing mechanically. It's like a little mechanical mechanism that computes a Fourier transform of sound, which is like mind-blowingly cool. So I'm not an expert on cochlear implants, but as I understand it, it's the real limitation is not in sort of computing the Fourier transform. We can do that with arbitrary precision. You can compute as many frequencies as we want from this sound. It's the actual electrodes that stimulate the cochlea, how many of those you can pack onto this little wire, how tightly spaced they can be, and as I understand it, there's actually a fundamental limitation to how closely you can pack those electrodes, because when they stimulate the basilar membrane, the electricity spreads out a little bit. And so if you put them closer together than some limit, it just doesn't add anything, because the sort of electrical charge spreads out anyway. So I don't know really where that fundamental limit is and how close we are to it, but as I understand, there is just a fundamental limit in terms of that mechanism of using electricity to stimulate the membrane in that way.
The other thing I'd add to that is that, so Nace talked a little bit about hair cells, and there are different types of hair cells actually. There are inner hair cells and outer hair cells, and they have different roles in sharpening that response. And so actually maybe part of the reason for cochlear implants not amplifying the frequencies as sharply is you're getting rid of some of the action of the outer hair cells that would normally be able to sharpen specific frequency responses along the cochlea. And yeah, also to the point about sending the signals to the brain, it's also, how do you get those, even if you had that perfect representation, how do you get it to the brain for processing? So you'd still need to find the wires and figure out, how do I send the low frequency sound to the low frequency wire so that it gets all the way up to the rest of the brain. And that's, you saw those complicated pathways, it's still something that we're trying to work out.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. My question is about the future of technological devices that can aid either hearing impaired people, or such as, because now I think if we have like cochlear devices and there are hearing aids, so is there going to be something else, or are those just going to become more developed and better at what they do?
Both. So I think, so one thing actually that I talk about in my, so I'm teaching language in the brain right now to undergrads here at UT. I also teach graduate audiology students, and we've been talking about how, at least in terms of hearing aids, there's this new idea of what's called a cognitive hearing aid. This is it's not on the market yet, it's still under development, and the idea is that one of the things that we have problems with is, of course, people can have hearing aids that just turn up the loudness of everything that you're hearing, but they're not able to help you zoom in to only listen to one person that you want to listen to and filter out the person next to them or the music behind you. And so there are some ways that people are thinking of using brain signals in addition to that. And so there are brain signals that will track the sound of a person that we are trying to attend to. And so there's actually this idea that you could maybe add EEG to a hearing aid, and the EEG would track the brain signal saying, I want to pay attention to you and not you, sorry, and then just basically turn up only that portion of the sound. So that's one very cool, I think, future technology that we can expect to see. That's still peripheral. I'd say then the other would be things like brain-computer interfaces, so going directly to the brain. And those are some things that actually both of us work on related projects for that, and that would be actually trying to help someone, not necessarily for hearing, but also for communication, so helping to take brain signals and turn that into a communicative device. I don't know if you have things to add to that.
Yeah, a lot of the sort of brain-machine interface work around language actually has to do with the other direction. So taking, or the sort of the goal is in the other direction. It's taking brain signals and turning them into speech or sort of production instead of doing perception with them for people who can't speak for various reasons. But yeah, I mean, this is a very active field of development. There's a lot of new technology sort of appearing in this area, so I think that's going to be exciting to see over the next few years.
What do you think will be the most promising in terms of people who are hearing impaired?
I mean, certainly I have hope for these cognitive hearing aids. I think also better directional microphones, that would be probably more near-term development. And then also there are machine learning algorithms that can separate speech streams, so simultaneous speech. And so I think the hardware will get better at being able to allow you to separate different streams of sounds and only turn up the volume on ones that you want to. Of course, one thing that I've talked to audiologists about is that one worry is that if you add EEG to a hearing aid, maybe it makes it much more expensive or it makes it much larger and then people don't want to wear it. So I think there are other issues that we also have to deal with in designing these sorts of technologies so that they will be adopted and that people have access if they need it. So it's another side.
One of the things I might add to that is that we have 2 ears. And so another area of development is to actually use 2 cochlear prostheses. I didn't really go into it in too much detail in my talk, but we actually use information from the 2 ears to help us filter out sounds and to localize sounds. And so when we bypass and we only stimulate 1 ear, we actually don't really take advantage of all that processing capability. Now, that said, implanting 2 devices is of course more expensive and more traumatic surgically. But that is an area of intense new research.
So, sorry, before you start, can I read one question from the cards here? So this question was, my husband has the amazing gift of perfect pitch, always had it. What causes some people to have this? Is it genetics? Nace? Tell us.
Well, so actually my mother has perfect pitch as well. Ooh. And darn her, she didn't pass it on to me. But we don't know, actually, what causes perfect pitch and why some people have it and some people don't. You can get better with training. Musicians who don't have perfect pitch can nevertheless, really greatly improve their, pitch discrimination abilities. So you can learn and get better and train yourselves to discriminate pitch better. But how perfect pitch actually happens is really unknown at this point.
I want to add there's some tantalizing, weird things about perfect pitch. So one thing that I learned a while ago that surprised the heck out of me was most of us actually have much closer to perfect pitch than we realize. Not in terms of hearing a note and saying that's a B flat or whatever, but if I asked you to hum the first few bars of Stairway to Heaven, it turns out that most people do this they get really close to the recording, the standard recording. So our memories for sounds are actually really close, and we can produce these pitches that are actually very close to sort of our memory for it. So yeah, it's strange. And why is that not the same as being able to hear a sound and recognize it as a specific pitch? We don't know. It seems like musical training early in life is a pretty important thing for acquiring perfect pitch, but it's unclear whether that's a sort of selection effect thing that unless you had musical training early in life, you would never know that you had perfect pitch. Right?
Great presentation. Thank you. Now we've had panel members. We're in 2019. What are the facts and what are the myths about auditory system and alcohol, caffeine, THC, legal drugs or illegal drugs to enhance your hearing?
I think I would start by saying that alcohol might make it appear like you're hearing better. But it probably does very little to actually make that happen in reality.
So alcohol does make your ears ring. Is that like a central thing, or is this a peripheral thing?
I
Do you
actually
know?
did not know that.
Huh. Well, we're gonna have to look that one up.
but I don't know why.
I don't know if I have anything to add to that. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, it is true that lots of, for example, medications and drugs can actually induce tinnitus. It's a side effect of a lot of medications, so there can be a lot of sort of chemical causes. A notorious generator of tinnitus is high doses of aspirin.
So that was one of the questions from the crowd too. Can medications induce tinnitus?
Yes,
So-
yes, they
Yeah,
can.
definitely.
And traumas, like you get into a car accident. Right? The ears apparatus is extremely delicate, and it doesn't really take much. In order to be so sensitive, it's also delicate and fragile. And so medications, traumas, literally buffeting your body around can actually generate tinnitus.
Me? Oh, okay. I didn't know if we were going back and forth or. Go ahead. Okay. I suffer from tinnitus. I have my whole life, and so do a lot of people in my family. So, in the age of holistic health, I've looked towards possible herbal supplements and vitamin or minerals to help out in that area. And one of the things that I ran across was that the tinnitus might have an origin in a deficiency in zinc or B12. I didn't know if you had any information. Either A, is that true or not? And B, can you point me in a direction of something that might have some scientific backing to it?
So I don't know as much about vitamin B12 for hearing health, actually, but being deficient in vitamin B12 can lead to a lot of strange neurological effects, actually. So if people don't absorb vitamin B12, they can end up with strange psychoses, actually, that can go away as soon as they make sure they're getting enough vitamins. But in terms of, for tinnitus, I'm actually not sure for that. I know that what I've heard more about are things like noise therapies or notch noise therapies or CBT, cognitive behavioral therapies. But yeah, I think it's still very much an area of active research because people are trying to figure out what is a good way to treat it, and I don't think we have great answers. Although we do, I guess a quick plug, we do have the UT Speech and Hearing Clinic here on campus, and there are people there who, so Dr. Julia Campbell is a fellow audiology faculty member who does study tinnitus, and so probably has more information on that than I do.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Let me read one from a card here. This is going for Nace, I think. Do animals that can detect high frequency, presumably higher frequency sounds than humans, have the same hearing mechanisms as humans?
Yeah, the answer is yes, they do. In fact, really all mammals have remarkably similar neural circuits that convey auditory information. Now, every animal has their sort of unique hearing requirements. For example, bats hear into the ultrasound, but they have some of the same brain, really almost all of the same brain nuclei. But they've been sometimes tweaked in ways. For example, there are areas that respond to ultrasound in the brain. Low frequencies, some of the nuclei that typically are used to process low frequencies have been commandeered and basically do different jobs than they did formerly. But there is a basic mammalian plan, and birds too, despite the fact that they've evolved completely separately from mammals, have a lot of analogous circuitry that do some of the same jobs because a lot of the auditory processing needs are very similar and actually demand sort of similar solutions from neural circuitry. So yes, there's a very, and that's actually encouraging for us because we can't do experiments on humans that we can do in lower animals, and so we can actually take advantage of the fact that we can study mammalian hearing in sort of lower, smaller mammals and actually be able to hope that we can apply that knowledge and research toward human hearing. And of course, we can do much more involved in more elaborate experiments in rodents, for example.
One thing I'll add to that too is the lovely slide that you had on different animals' ears. Actually, the shapes of even the pinna, the sort of outer part of the outer ear, that can also help to funnel the sounds into your ear canal in different ways. And so you'll see that some bats that have very high frequency hearing have these ridges that actually help them apparently to hear even higher frequencies than we're able to hear. So I don't know, maybe someday we'll have some pinna prosthetics as well to, I don't know. If you want Spock-like hearing.
Cosplayers are way ahead of us.
Yeah.
One interesting, just random comparative auditory system fact that I like is that, so I often thought of like birds as having, very good hearing. You think of like owls as being, these remarkably adept hunters. But birds can't hear even as well as we can in terms of frequencies. So I think most birds top out at around 8 to 10 kilohertz. Like that's the highest frequency they can hear. We can hear about twice as high, up to 20 kilohertz. Rodents frequently, I think, hear up to 60, 100 kilohertz, something like that, much higher than we do. So this might be actually one of the reasons that rodents do hear such high frequencies and why actually they communicate using very high frequencies. When you have maybe rat babies that are squeaking for their mother, they want to do so in a way that doesn't, alert all the owls in the area. So they can squeak. They moved all their sort of communication up into these very high frequencies that aren't accessible to their predators.
Question. So I was going to say something about hearing loss in men's selective hearing, but never mind. How can hearing loss truly lead to early onset dementia? And if it does that mean that we're all headed for early onset dementia? Just curious.
This was also a question on a card.
Well, first of all, I'll say that there is currently no cure for spousal auditory neglect. And there really isn't one on the horizon, I'm sorry to say. So are we headed careening toward dementia? There's such individual variability, like any neurological disease. There's no predictive value. It will depend on, of course, also your experience, how much hearing loss some hearing loss can be genetic in origin. Some hearing loss is environmental, right? You work on a construction site all your life. My in-laws live in India and in a really busy, loud street, and they're all half deaf. You have to shout on the phone for them to hear you. So there are lots of different causes for deafness, and sort of the nature of the insults and when they happen, and also your individual, how good your genes are, and a lot of other complicated factors factor in. So there's really no predictive value to what is going to happen to your hearing and what other effects that might lead to neurologically.
So a follow-up to that, does that mean then that if it's environmental versus genetic, that if it's environmental you may not have early onset dementia, but if it's genetic you might?
I think it's really hard to address that. First of all, let me just say I'm not an MD, so I shouldn't answer that question. But the causes of deafness and hearing loss are so diverse, and individual to individual variability is also so high that it would really depend on the details of the case.
So, can I add to this?
Please.
So, as I understand, the link between hearing loss and dementia is really about the richness of experience in life, and that social isolation and sort of withdrawing from social life is something that we think is an important risk factor, or something that leads, in some cases, to dementia. As far as I know, that this is a correlational thing. This is not sort of a proven fact that this happens, but it seems to be strongly linked in some way. So the potential mechanism there would be that people who have very severe hearing loss and thus sort of withdraw from social situations, their brains are less stimulated because they spend less time, communicating, having fun conversations, et cetera, and that this would lead to dementia.
Okay, I think it's my turn. So I used to have hearing in both ears, and then I had a mastoidectomy and my inner ear rebuilt. So now I only hear out of one. But I can't tell directionality of sound at all. Like if someone says my name, I have no idea where it's coming from. So 2 parts. What's up with that? And the other part is, will my brain adapt to eventually be able to hear where things are coming from?
Oh, I can certainly
The
take that one.
expert.
That's the topic of my research. So we absolutely need 2
You can
ears
study
to
me.
hear direction. And I'm sad to say, if you don't have 2 ears, you will never develop that ability. You may be able to use other cues more effectively in the absence of what we call binaural cues. But we use 2 things. One is the time differences between the 2 ears. That actually is the cue that allows us to detect where sounds are in horizontal space, but also because we've got big, thick heads that particularly shield high-frequency sounds. You get a little bit of a shadowing effect. So a sound over here is going to be louder in this ear than the opposite ear. And that's another cue. We are very sensitive to these level differences between the 2 ears. So between the time differences and the level differences, we sort of jointly encode where sounds are in horizontal space. And we use a different cue, actually, to localize in elevation. So the bad news for you is that without the second ear, you can't put it together. We really need 2 ears to hear. But you
Would a
can get
cochlear
some
implant
information
replace that?
about locations just from actually the third cue, which is actually the funny pattern of interferences that sounds have when they bounce off the ridges and valleys of your ears. And so you can, it's known that we can sort of put more energy or more brain power into sort of focusing on different types of cues. And so without the binaural cues, probably your nervous system is putting all of its investment into other cues that'll help you do as well as you can. But yes, having 2 ears is actually essential for sound localization. And as a result, also helping to segregate sound sources in a complex environment.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, I'm going to read one from the cards really quick. So this says, I used to hate wearing my hearing aids as a kid. Now I'm much better at using them, but I used to feel like my aided hearing was too loud, even though it's still less than normal hearing. Why is it so overstimulating? So.
Well, I think that this likely ties into some of the mechanisms that Nace was talking about during his talk regarding overexcitability or under inhibition of the auditory system when it doesn't have its normal inputs. So when each of the brain areas along this pathway, along the auditory pathway, each of these areas thinks like, I should be getting this much input and I should be making about this much output. And if they're getting too little input, then they try to turn up, they try to sort of amplify more whatever's coming in to make their output be as big as it should be. So if the person who asked this question was either born or spent a lot of time with not much hearing, and thus many of these areas maybe didn't receive enough input, maybe their brain areas adapted to that and so turned up the gain effectively. Like they all turned up their little volume knobs inside your head. And then when the outside volume knob got turned up, each of these brain areas had to sort of learn how to tone it down so that everything seemed normal. That would be my explanation.
And I think I might actually repeat something that Liberty said earlier, I think, which is that, one of the notorious problems of hearing aids is that they amplify everything. The things that you presumably want to pay attention to, but also everything else. And that may also give you a sense that there's just too much. The thing that you're attending to is not loud enough, but everything else is sort of swamping it out. And so you can sort of get an overall impression of, overstimulation.
Okay, so I was wondering if you think that everybody is born with perfect pitch, but they just don't fine tune it or use it when they're young, and they lose the ability to see perfect pitch.
That's a great question.
It is. I don't know.
So I would say that there are likely some people who might be predisposed to being better at being able to have perfect pitch later on with training and with practice. But one of the fascinating things about the auditory system, not only for perfect pitch, but for learning languages, is that babies can tell the difference between sounds from all the languages of the world. And it's only when we become around, I mean, it's still pretty early, but by the time a baby is 1 year old, then they have already formed ideas of what the sounds are that are in their language and the sounds that are not in their language. So I think, part of it is, yes, we have this amazing ability to be able to hear the differences in sounds, and if we practice them a lot, so if you practiced with pitch and that was something that's very meaningful in your environment, then you could maybe get very good at it. One thing that we didn't mention about perfect pitch actually is that there's some evidence, I don't know how strong it is, that people who speak tonal languages, so for example, Mandarin Chinese is a language where the pitch of a syllable can actually change the meaning of the word. And so you could have the same syllable like ma, and depending on whether it's a rising tone or a falling tone, the pitch actually changes the word. And so for people who speak those types of languages, the absolute pitch is much more important as a cue because it has a meaning for, did you mean horse or did you mean scold? So those are two examples. So I think people could get better, but I think there still do seem to be some differences, either genetic or environmental, where if some people just become brilliant artists, some people become brilliant pianists, and we all have potential, but it's part practice and part what's in you. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to read a question from a card here. Can you explain about ASMR? Nace, do you know about ASMR?
I think that one's yours.
Okay, so ASMR is what is it? Autonomic sensory meridian response. It's garbage. Like those words mean nothing. It's not a scientific term. It sounds like a scientific term, but it's not. This is this phenomenon where some people, I don't get this, but they have this feeling that when they hear sounds like this, then they get a strange feeling inside their head. When they hear soft sounds like that, there's a strange feeling that they get, like a tingling inside their heads. This seems like it has to be real. Like people say that they feel this. You could do this if you search on YouTube. You'll find 10 million videos that give people ASMR.
And some people find it very relaxing. They'll use these to go to sleep.
Yeah.
Some people hate it.
So there have been, my sister-in-law asked me about this a few years ago because she was like, you're a neuroscientist, what's the deal? And I looked it up, and they're actually, the first scientific study on ASMR was published about 5 years ago. They said, okay, this is a thing, we have no idea what it is. That was kind of it. I don't think the scientific consensus has really grown since then, so no, we can't really explain it. I'm sorry.
There's something that is, so no one asked this question, but does anyone have the opposite of that? Is there anyone here who, there are certain sounds that they hear that they just hate, and they get angry, like mouth sounds?
Oh.
Yeah. I'm also one of those people. So apparently this is something that people are starting to study more, called misophonia, and this is sort of this irrational hatred of certain sounds where you just, if you hear someone chewing or certain things, it just makes you really cringe.
Oh my God.
And that, the mechanisms behind that aren't really known either, but unfortunately that's kind of the opposite to ASMR, where ASMR is like this pleasurable feeling. Misophonia is like rage. But there you go. The auditory system is a mysterious place.
Well, several things I'll be looking at when I go home tonight.
Yeah.
So regarding that share. When people do this with their papers, with their fingernails, that caused me a pain throughout my entire body to hear that.
Yeah.
With that
Yeah.
one, I can't even think about it. I don't know what that's about, but don't do it. So my question had to do with the protection for the ears. I was recently in the market for buying some for concerts because I love ACL. But I don't want to go deaf. So at that time, when I started looking on Amazon and doing research and finding all the different products that were available that besides what I thought I would be finding, and just the little things that you twist around and stick in your ear, for that musicians use, like drummers and guitarists, and they're supposed to allow a range of sound, but tone it down, so which I thought sounded amazing. But there's so many different, like the range. I mean, what would you recommend? I mean, as far as features, I want to buy something where I can enjoy the music and hear the range of sound, but be protected as well, because these are things that are weird cones that stick in. They have the different opening sizes and different ranges of decibels that are. It was overwhelming. As great of an idea and purchase as it was going to be, it was overwhelming to try to just pick something. So, thank you.
I'm a person who wears a lot of earplugs because I do MRI, and we have to wear earplugs every time we go in an MRI scanner. I have no idea. I've seen all these same things. I have the same experience of seeing 1,000 different earplugs, and I'm sure there are ones that cost a lot of money and are just hokum, right? So I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer for you. I'm sorry.
I think my understanding of it is that, particularly if it's in ear, the seal around your, there's both the quality of the earplug itself, but also just how well they fit your ear. If they don't fit well and they're sort of loose, they're not going to provide the kind of protection that you would hope for. And so I think a lot of it's just comfort, and does it actually fit your ear well? But I think, the specifications, it's maybe not as complicated as it might be. It'll tell you how much attenuation and what frequency range it will have. Probably, it's not something where the really specific details will matter that much to your listening and enjoyment. It's whatever feels the most comfortable and maybe doesn't, make you look too wacky.
I would say the cheap ones that you can get that are just little foam ones, those will maybe tend to block out some more of the high frequency sounds. And so I think sometimes people find that listening to music is less pleasurable because it really you just get kind of a muddy bass kind of sound. So they do have musicians' earplugs and things like that will try to attenuate those sounds a little bit less or have a more even range, so that you're not only making high frequencies really quiet, but sort of more evenly doing that. I don't have a suggestion for a particular type, although I know there's a student from audiology who is trying to make a booth for next year's ACL where they will be showing different types of earplugs, so you can check it out next year. I think they're calling it Love Music Forever.
That's good.
Let me read a question from the cards here. So this question was, if 75% of people over 70 have significant hearing loss, is that all from exposure to loud noises and cumulative damage, or is there also a degenerative breakdown caused from age?
That's an interesting
one. Well, do you have a good answer for that?
Likely both. I would say that you could have earlier onset hearing loss if you are someone who listens to a lot of loud music, or if you work in an environment where you're exposed to a lot of loud sounds. Generally, there are regulations through places like OSHA where, if you are at a loud construction site, you're supposed to wear certain types of hearing protection. But I think a lot of it, just age-related hearing loss, can just be part of the aging process. And so you can protect your hearing to the best of your ability, but sometimes things just happen too. It's
actually hard to track down because we can't avoid experience.
Right.
There's no no one you can compare that hasn't been exposed in really idiosyncratic ways to a lifetime of different sounds.
I think one of the interesting questions there has to do with the gender difference in hearing loss.
Absolutely.
This is something that's been known for a long time, that men go deaf at much higher rates. Old men go deaf at much higher rates than older women. But it was really unclear how much of this was due to environmental factors, right? Because when people started studying this in the 1970s, there was still a culture of women mostly worked in the home and men worked jobs, right? So there's massive correlation between what these people did in their lives and the hearing loss that came later. But as I understand it, that doesn't explain all the difference. I think there's still, men have some tendency to to go deaf, even if you account for environmental factors. But yeah.
There's also potentially hormonal differences that can lead to differences in hearing ability, and also this phenomenon. So for those of you who've maybe had lots of hearing tests, you might have had to have otoacoustic emission testing. If you've heard of this, this is measuring sounds that come out of your ears. You play 2 tones or you play a click to your ear, it goes through the cochlea, and then there's a new tone that comes back out your ear. And it turns out that, and this is part of a normal, healthy, functioning cochlea. This is something that you expect to see. But there are actually gender differences in the sort of amplitude, how large those types of responses are, and people are still trying to figure out, is it just because overall men's head sizes tend to be a little bit larger than women's head sizes, and thus maybe the cochlea is a little bit bigger, so it has different resonant properties, or is it hormonal? We still don't really know, but there are definitely these interesting sex differences in cochlear function, for sure.
I think I've seen a lot of interesting research on the effects of estrogen on neuroprotection, and it's actually something that really should be studied more than it is. And I think there really isn't a consensus at this point on the effects of estrogen on protection from noise damage, but it is an area of active investigation.
Hi, my question is about sound amplification versus the loud voice. I'm the director of a daytime program. Actually, we serve individuals with dementia, but we have a number of volunteers, intergenerational, but most are going towards the senior spectrum. And I have a moderate hearing loss, so I'm very sensitive that I want everybody to hear. So I pull out our sound system, I pull out the microphone, and the answer, it's usually a man, the answer is, I don't need the microphone, I have a loud voice. And I reply, well, the microphone's not for you, it's for the other people to hear. So I wonder, I did mention this to my audiologist who talked about sound dissipation. And I wondered if you all could speak to that so I can give them more meat to what I try to continue to promote.
Tell them to put on the microphone.
That's what I usually do. I just
it.
say, just use the microphone.
Yeah, it's not for you. It's for the people who can't hear as well.
Right.
I don't know. I've definitely.
It's I hear that over and over again, though, and but sound with a loud voice. How does that? Because that's always what people use. Is I've got a loud voice. People can hear me. So, do you know any?
Well, some people do.
Some people do. I think.
Right.
In a lot of cases, people aren't as loud or as consistently loud as they like to think they are. They aren't as clear as they like to think they are when they speak.
or people will turn their head to the side, you know, and then
And they're
right, you
talking.
lose it. So yeah, you really want someone to wear,
Exactly.
if they can, a lapel mic that is going to move with them.
I think, Liberty, you also mentioned bone conduction. So probably there's a little self-stimulation that happens when you're speaking that other people are not getting.
Yes, yeah, that's true too. Yeah,
Interesting.
you can hear
Interesting.
yourself louder.
And also, some people just don't like the idea of a microphone. Something about it bothers them. I don't know if any of you've run into that, but just tell them to use the microphone.
Yeah, I've seen it. I think maybe people just need to, number one, get over it, and then also learn to talk in a more normal voice instead of projecting into the microphone, which would get unpleasant. I
That's
guess.
true.
Yeah.
That's true. All right. Thank you.
Speaking of microphones.
Here we go. So, thank you.
What a great
I know there's
segue.
some more. I'm very sorry. There's more people waiting, but one person who has a loud voice is the person who is supposed to make sure that we stop at 8:30. So, we need to stop. I'm really sorry, but please thank Liberty and Alex and Nace for it. Thank you for being here. If you didn't get your question answered, send it to us. And I just want to send you home by saying that we are arranging 9 dates next year, so we'll be doing this again next year in this venue. So thank you for helping with that. One of our goals for next year is to get some more high school students here. So if you can help us spread the word in that direction, we're sort of hoping to have a very broad range of ages from high school students that we'd like to turn on to neuroscience to the rest of us who care about successes. So if you could brainstorm ways to help us think about that, that would be great. And otherwise, please drive safe, and we'll see you next September. So thanks.